The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of a small apartment in Seoul, casting warm patterns across an old upright piano that had seen better days. Its brown wood was slightly faded and a few keys stuck when pressed too hard. But to little Mina, it was the most magical thing in the world. At 4 years old, Mina could barely see over the piano's music stand. Her feet dangled high above the floor, swinging back and forth as she concentrated on the keys in front of her. Her mother, who was washing dishes in the nearby kitchen, had grown used to the sounds coming from the living room. Sometimes they were just random notes, playful experiments that made her smile. But lately something had changed. Mina's tiny fingers were playing an actual melody, not just any melody, but something her mother recognized from a classical music station that played in the background during breakfast. The notes weren't perfect, and the rhythm wasn't quite right, but the tune was unmistakably there. Her mother dried her hands on a dish towel and walked quietly to the doorway, watching her daughter with growing amazement. This wasn't the first time she'd noticed something unusual about Mina. When her daughter was only 2 years old, barely speaking in full sentences, she would hum along to songs on the radio. That alone wasn't remarkable. Many toddlers loved music. But Mina didn't just hum simple nursery rhymes. She hummed complex melodies she'd heard only once, remembering every rise and fall of the tune with startling accuracy. At family gatherings, relatives would request their favorite songs, and Mina would hum them back perfectly, much to everyone's delight and surprise. Her uncle, who played guitar at a local church, once said she had what musicians call perfect pitch. But her mother didn't know much about music theory. She just knew her daughter was different. The piano had come into their lives almost by accident. A neighbor was moving to a smaller apartment and couldn't take the instrument with them. They offered it for free to anyone who would haul it away. Mina's father and his brother had struggled up 3 flights of stairs with the heavy thing, complaining and laughing the whole way. Her mother had worried it was a waste of space in their already cramped apartment, but the moment Mina saw it, her eyes lit up like it was her birthday. She climbed onto the bench immediately, pressing keys randomly at first, delighted by the sounds each one made. That was 6 months ago. Now, without a single lesson, she was somehow teaching herself to play actual songs. Her mother knew they couldn't afford piano lessons. Money was tight. Her father worked long hours at a manufacturing plant, and she took care of Mina while doing alterations and sewing work from home. Music lessons were a luxury for families with more resources. Still, watching her daughter's obvious joy and natural ability felt like witnessing something that shouldn't be ignored. One evening, after putting Mina to bed, she mentioned her concerns to her husband. He was exhausted from work, but he listened as she described what their daughter had been doing. At first, he was skeptical. Every parent thinks their child is special. But the next morning, he sat and listened to Mina play. He heard it too. The way her small hands found the right keys. The way she corrected herself when a note sounded wrong. The complete focus on her face. This wasn't just a child banging on a piano. That weekend, they made an unusual decision. They would ask Mina's grandmother, who lived on the outskirts of the city, if she could help with a few lessons. The grandmother knew someone from church, a retired music teacher who might be willing to at least assess Mina's abilities. It was a long shot, but they had to try. 2 weeks later, they found themselves in Professor Huang's home studio. The elderly teacher had agreed to meet Mina only as a favor to the grandmother, making it clear he didn't typically teach children under 6 years old. Young children rarely had the attention span or discipline required, he explained. Their tiny hands weren't developed enough for serious study. He'd seen too many pushy parents forcing unwilling kids to learn instruments, creating more frustration than music. Professor Huang was in his 70s, with silver hair and glasses that slid down his nose when he looked at sheet music. His studio was filled with certificates, photos of past students, and shelves of music books. A beautiful grand piano dominated the room, its black surface so polished Mina could see her reflection in it. The professor asked Mina to sit at the piano. He didn't expect much. He'd agreed to this meeting to be polite, planning to gently suggest they wait a few years. He asked her to play anything she knew. Mina didn't hesitate. She started playing the melody she'd been working on at home. Her technique was completely unschooled, her posture all wrong, but something in her playing made Professor Huang lean forward in his chair. He recognized the piece. It was a simplified version of a classical theme, something she must have heard on television or radio. When she finished, he asked her to play it again, but this time to try playing it slower. She did, adjusting her speed without any difficulty. He played a simple scale and asked if she could copy it. She could. He played a short melody with his right hand. She replicated it almost perfectly. For the next 20 minutes, the professor continued testing her, his expression growing more serious with each exercise. Finally, he removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a habit he had when thinking deeply. He looked at Mina's parents, who were sitting nervously on a small couch against the wall. "Your daughter has an exceptional ear," he said carefully. "What she's doing without any training is quite remarkable. However, I must be honest with you. Having talent is one thing. Developing it requires enormous commitment, not just from the child, but from the entire family. It means daily practice, sacrifice, and patience. Many talented children lose interest. Others burn out from pressure." Mina's parents nodded, holding hands. They understood what he was saying. This could be a gift or a burden, depending on how they handled it. Professor Huang was quiet for a moment, then made a decision that surprised even himself. "I'll take her as a student, but only under certain conditions. She must genuinely want to learn. The moment she resists or loses joy in playing, we stop. No exceptions. And you," he looked at the parents firmly, "must promise never to pressure her. She's 4 years old. She needs to play outside, make friends, and be a child. Music should add to her life, not consume it." They agreed immediately, relief and excitement flooding their faces. Professor Huang scheduled their first proper lesson for the following week. As the family prepared to leave, Mina turned back to look at the grand piano one more time, her small hand reaching out to touch its smooth surface gently, as if saying goodbye to a new friend. Walking home that evening, Mina held both her parents' hands, swinging between them happily, humming a tune that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. Her mother and father exchanged glances over her head, both feeling the same mixture of hope and uncertainty. They had no idea where this path would lead, but they knew their daughter's life had just taken an unexpected turn. The old upright piano in their apartment suddenly seemed less like a lucky accident and more like the beginning of something they couldn't yet imagine. Within months, that small beginning would grow into something extraordinary, leading them to places they'd never dreamed possible. 6 months had passed since Mina started lessons with Professor Huang, and the change in her playing was remarkable. What had begun as natural talent was now being shaped by discipline and proper technique. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, her mother would take her across the city by bus to the professor's studio, a journey that took nearly an hour each way. Mina never complained about the long ride. She would sit by the window, watching the city pass by, sometimes tapping rhythms on her lap that only she could hear. Other passengers would smile at the small girl with the serious expression, unaware they were sitting next to someone quite extraordinary. Professor Huang had been teaching piano for over 40 years, and he'd seen many talented students come and go. Some had gone on to music conservatories. Others had chosen different paths, but Mina was different from all of them. It wasn't just her ability to learn quickly or her natural musicality. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. When she played, she wasn't just hitting the right notes. She was feeling the music in a way that usually took decades to develop. During their lessons, he would sometimes stop her mid-piece and ask, "Why did you play that section softer?" She would think for a moment, her small face scrunched in concentration, and say something like, "Because it felt sad there." She was right, of course. The piece was meant to express melancholy in that passage, but she knew this instinctively, without reading the composer's notes or understanding the Italian terms written on the sheet music. By the time Mina turned 4.5, she was working on pieces that his 10-year-old student struggled with. Her small hands were still a limitation. She couldn't reach octaves yet, but she worked around it with creativity that surprised him. More importantly, she still loved playing. There were no tears, no resistance, no signs of the burnout he'd warned her parents about. One afternoon in late autumn, Professor Huang received an email that made him pause. It was from the International Youth Music Association, announcing their annual global competition in Vienna, Austria. He'd seen these announcements for years, rarely paying them much attention. His students were talented, but competition at that level was fierce. attracting young musicians from around the world who had trained in prestigious academies. He almost deleted the email, but something made him read further. There was a section about the competition categories, age requirements, and application process. The youngest category was for children aged 7 to 10. Mina was only 4. Still, as he sat at his desk that evening, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Over the next few days, an idea began forming in his mind. It was probably foolish. The odds of a 4-year-old being accepted were essentially 0. The competition would be overwhelming, expensive, and potentially discouraging for such a young child. Every logical part of his brain said to forget about it, but there was another part of him, the part that had dedicated his life to music, that wondered, what if? What if they submitted an audition video? What if the judges could see what he saw in this child? The worst they could say was no. During Mina's next lesson, Professor Huang mentioned the competition to her mother, speaking carefully. He explained it was probably a long shot, maybe even impossible, but he'd been thinking about having Mina record a piece anyway, just for the experience. Her mother listened quietly, wringing her hands nervously. "We couldn't afford to go to Vienna," she said softly. "Even if somehow they accepted her, which seems impossible, the travel costs alone would be beyond what we could manage." Professor Huang nodded. He'd expected this. The family was barely managing the lesson fees, which he'd already reduced significantly. "Let's not worry about that yet," he said gently. "Let's just make a recording. Consider it part of her training. Learning to perform for a camera is a valuable skill." What he didn't tell her was that he'd already decided to pay for the application fee himself, and if by some miracle Mina was accepted, he'd find a way to help with the costs. He had some savings, and he knew other teachers who might contribute. This child deserved a chance to be seen by the wider world. The following week, they prepared for the recording. Professor Huang had chosen Beethoven's For Elise for her audition piece. It was well-known, beautiful, and while not extremely difficult technically, it required emotional maturity to perform well. He'd been working on it with Mina for a month, and her interpretation was stunning. The day of the recording, Mina wore her favorite dress, a simple blue one with white flowers. Her mother had brushed her hair until it shined. They used the professor's own studio, setting up a borrowed video camera on a tripod. The room was quiet except for the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Mina seemed unconcerned about being recorded. She climbed onto the piano bench, adjusted herself the way she'd been taught, and placed her hands on the keys. Professor Huang nodded to her. She took a breath and began to play. For 3.5 minutes, the only sound in the room was Beethoven's timeless melody, flowing from the fingers of a child who was barely old enough for kindergarten. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. Her mother had tears in her eyes. Professor Huang quietly turned off the camera. They recorded it 3 times, though the first take was already beautiful. That evening, the professor stayed up late editing the video, adding a simple title card with Mina's name and age. He attached it to the application form, writing a brief explanation about her exceptional circumstances and requesting special consideration for her age. Before he could second-guess himself, he submitted it. Then he closed his laptop and tried not to think about it. The likelihood of hearing back was slim to none. 3 weeks passed. Life continued as normal. Mina came for her lessons, practiced at home on their old piano, and played with neighborhood children in the courtyard of their apartment building. Professor Huang didn't mention the competition again. There was no point in building up hope when the chances were so small. Then on a Tuesday morning, an email arrived. Professor Huang was drinking his morning tea when he saw the subject line. EMA competition application, acceptance notification. His hand shook slightly as he opened it. He read the first line once, then again, unable to quite believe what he was seeing. Mina had been accepted. Not only accepted, but the judges had been so impressed by her audition that they were granting her special permission to compete despite being well below the minimum age requirement. The email praised her extraordinary musical maturity and remarkable technical ability. For such a young performer, they wanted her in Vienna in 8 weeks. Professor Huang sat back in his chair, his tea forgotten. This changed everything. Now came the hard part. He had to tell Mina's parents, and together they had to figure out how to make this impossible thing possible. That afternoon, When Mina and her mother arrived for the lesson, Professor Huang asked if her father could come to the next session. He had something important to discuss with both of them. Her mother agreed, curiosity and concern mixing in her expression. 2 days later, all three adults sat in the studio while Mina played quietly with a small toy in the corner. Professor Huang explained everything: the competition, the application, and finally the acceptance. He watched their faces shift from confusion to disbelief to something like panic. "Vienna?" her father said quietly. "That's halfway around the world. We don't even have passports." "The costs," her mother began, then stopped, overwhelmed. Professor Huang raised his hand gently. "I know this seems impossible, but I didn't mention this lightly. I have some savings. I've also contacted a few colleagues, and several have already offered to contribute. There's a music foundation in Seoul that provides grants for young musicians. We can apply there too." He leaned forward, his voice earnest. "I've been teaching for over 40 years. I may never have another student like your daughter. This competition could open doors for her that we can't even imagine. But more than that, she deserves to be heard. The world deserves to hear her." Mina's parents looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that longtime couples can have without words. Finally, her father spoke. "If we can find a way to afford it, if it doesn't put us into debt we can't recover from, then maybe. But only if Mina wants to do it." They all turned to look at the little girl in the corner. She had stopped playing and was watching them with her wide, curious eyes. Professor Huang called her over and knelt down to her level. "Mina, how would you feel about playing piano for people in another country? It would be a big trip on an airplane to a place called Vienna." Mina thought about this seriously, her small face thoughtful. "Would you come too?" she asked him. "Yes," he promised. "I would be there with you," she nodded. "Okay, I can play for them." Just like that, the decision was made. None of them fully understood what they were agreeing to, or how dramatically their lives were about to change. They only knew that sometimes opportunities come along that are too important to ignore, no matter how impossible they seem. The real work was just beginning. The 8 weeks before the competition passed in a blur of preparation, paperwork, and mounting anxiety. Getting passports rushed through took connections Professor Huang didn't even know he had. The Music Foundation grant came through, covering about half the travel costs. The professor used his savings for the rest, despite Mina's parents' protests. Several of his former students, now successful musicians themselves, sent contributions when they heard about Mina's opportunity. The practice routine intensified, but Professor Huang was careful to keep his promise. Mina still played outside with friends. She still attended her preschool 3 mornings a week. But now, every afternoon was dedicated to perfecting for Elise, working on her stage presence, and preparing her mentally for what was to come. Her mother spent evenings watching videos of past competitions online, growing more nervous with each one. The other children looked so polished, so professional in their formal concert wear, performing pieces that sounded impossibly complex. She would glance at Mina, asleep in the next room, and wonder if they were making a terrible mistake. Her father was quieter about his concerns, but they were there. He'd taken extra shifts at work to build up a small emergency fund, just in case something went wrong. At night, he'd stand in the doorway of Mina's room watching her sleep, wondering what kind of pressure they were putting on someone so young. Only Mina seemed unworried. To her, it was an adventure. She was going to fly in an airplane for the first time. She was going to see a new country, and she'd get to play piano for people, which was something she loved doing anyway. The weight of expectation that pressed down on the adults around her simply didn't exist in her world yet. The flight to Vienna was long and exhausting. Mina slept for parts of it, her head resting on her mother's shoulder. Professor Huang sat across the aisle, reviewing notes and trying not to think about all the things that could go wrong. They landed early in the morning, Vienna time, all of them disoriented and tired. The city was beautiful in a way that took their breath away. Old buildings with intricate architecture lined streets that had existed for centuries. The competition had arranged accommodations in a modest hotel near the concert hall. Their room was small but clean, with a window overlooking a quiet street where people sat at cafes drinking coffee and reading newspapers. They had 2 days before the competition to adjust to the time difference and let Mina practice on the actual stage piano during the scheduled rehearsal time. Those 2 days felt both too long and too short. Mina was excited by everything, The different language, the unfamiliar food, the statues and fountains they passed on their walks. Her parents tried to match her enthusiasm while fighting off their own nervousness. The night before the competition, none of the adults slept well, but Mina drifted off easily, clutching a small stuffed rabbit she'd brought from home. In the darkness, her parents held hands and hoped they'd made the right choice. Competition day arrived cold and bright. The Musikverein concert hall was even more impressive in person than in photographs. Its cream and gold interior seemed to glow with history. Crystal chandeliers hung from ornately painted ceilings. Red velvet seats filled the auditorium. This was where some of the world's greatest musicians had performed. Families and competitors filled the hallways, speaking in dozens of different languages. Young musicians carried instrument cases and sheet music. Parents fussed over their children's appearance, straightening ties and smoothing dresses. There was a tension in the air, the kind that comes when months or years of preparation are about to be tested in just a few minutes on stage. Mina wore a simple white dress that her mother had sewn specially for this day, with a pale blue ribbon at the waist. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She looked even smaller than usual, surrounded by teenagers who towered over her, many of them looking confident and professional. When they checked in and received Mina's performance number, the coordinator did a double take at her age. Word quickly spread among the staff and other competitors. Whispers followed them as they made their way to the waiting area. Some looks were curious, others skeptical. A few older competitors seemed almost offended that someone so young had been allowed to enter. Professor Huang kept Mina away from the main waiting area, finding a quiet corner where she wouldn't be overwhelmed by the chaos. They sat together on a bench and he spoke to her gently, reminding her of everything they'd practiced. But mostly he just wanted her to stay calm and remember why she loved playing. The performances had started. They could hear piano music filtering through the walls, some pieces energetic and bold, others soft and delicate. Each young musician played for about 5 to 7 minutes, showcasing their technical skill and interpretation. The level of talent was staggering. These weren't just good student musicians. These were the best young pianists from their respective countries. Mina's mother felt her stomach churning. Her father kept checking his watch, counting down the minutes. They'd been told Mina would perform in the afternoon session, somewhere in the middle of the lineup. There were still hours to wait. They took turns walking Mina around the building, trying to keep her from getting restless or anxious. She seemed remarkably unbothered, more interested in the building's architecture than in the competition itself. She asked questions about the painted ceilings, wondered why some statues had missing noses, and wanted to know if they could hear the church bells that had rung earlier. Finally, the call came. Mina was 3 performances away. Professor Huang went over everything one last time. Posture, breathing, hand position, expression, but he could see she was starting to look overwhelmed by all the instructions, so he stopped. He knelt down, took her small hands in his, and spoke simply. Just play the way you do in my studio. Don't think about all these people or the other performers. Think about the music. Think about what Beethoven wanted people to feel. Can you do that? Mina nodded, her face serious but not frightened. They moved to the stage entrance. Through a gap in the curtain, they could see the audience, hundreds of people filling the seats. Judges sat in the front rows with clipboards and scoring sheets. Cameras recorded everything for the competition archives. The current performer, a teenage boy from Germany, was finishing his piece, his fingers flying across the keys with impressive speed. Applause filled the hall as he finished and bowed. Another performer went on, then another. Each one was technically skilled, well-rehearsed, and confident. Mina watched them from the wings, her expression unreadable. Then it was her turn. An announcer spoke in English. Next, performing Beethoven's Für Elise from South Korea, Mina Park, age 4. A murmur went through the audience. 4 years old. Some people leaned forward in their seats, curious. Others exchanged doubtful glances. In the judges section, several looked up from their notes with raised eyebrows. This would either be charming or uncomfortable. Everyone was expecting a cute performance, something to smile at before moving on to the serious competitors. Professor Huang gave Mina a gentle nudge. Her mother squeezed her hand one more time. Her father gave her an encouraging nod, though his face was pale with worry. Then Mina walked onto the stage alone, and they had to stay behind in the wings. The stage was vast from her perspective. The piano bench seemed far away, and the audience was a sea of faces all looking at her. For the first time since this journey began, Mina felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Her steps slowed slightly, but then she saw the piano, beautiful and black and inviting, and something settled inside her. That was familiar. That was safe. That was where the music lived. She reached the bench and waited while stage assistants adjusted its height and positioned a special platform for her feet so she could reach the pedals properly. The adjustments took longer than expected, and the audience grew restless. Someone coughed. Programs rustled. The wait felt eternal. Finally, everything was ready. Mina settled herself on the bench, her posture straight just as she'd been taught. She placed her small hands over the keys, feeling their smooth coolness under her fingers. She took a breath the way Professor Huang had shown her, breathing in for 4 counts, out for 4 counts. Then she closed her eyes for just a moment, finding that quiet place inside herself where only the music existed. When she opened them again, the nervousness was gone. She knew this piece. She loved this piece. It didn't matter where she was or who was watching. The music was all that mattered. Her fingers touched the keys, and the first notes of For Elise began to fill the concert hall. Delicate, gentle, the familiar melody that millions had heard before. But somehow, coming from this tiny child, it sounded new. In the wings, her mother grabbed her father's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Professor Huang held his breath, listening to every note, praying she wouldn't freeze or make a mistake that would shatter her confidence. But Mina just played, lost in the music, unaware that she was about to change everything. The opening notes of For Elise drifted through the concert hall, soft and careful. Mina's small fingers moved across the keys with a delicacy that seemed impossible for someone so young. The famous melody, one that almost everyone in the audience had heard countless times before, somehow sounded fresh and new. In the first few rows, the judges lowered their pens. They'd been prepared to score this performance quickly, to be kind but realistic about what a 4-year-old could accomplish. But something in those opening phrases made them pause and actually listen. The piece began with its gentle, almost hesitant theme. Mina played it with a tenderness that caught people off guard. This wasn't the mechanical playing of a child who had memorized finger positions. There was feeling in it, genuine emotion that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. Behind the curtain, Professor Huang stood perfectly still, barely breathing. He could hear every note, could tell when she was about to transition to each new section. So far, everything was perfect. But the piece had difficult passages ahead, moments where her small hands would be tested, where one mistake could cascade into more. Mina's mother had her eyes closed, unable to watch. She could hear the music but couldn't bear to see her daughter on that enormous stage. Her father's arm was around her shoulders, and she could feel him trembling slightly. Or maybe she was the one trembling. It was hard to tell. As Mina moved into the second section, something remarkable happened. The skeptical whispers in the audience stopped completely. People who had been checking their programs or adjusting in their seats grew still. The piece's character changed, becoming more animated, more playful, and Mina changed with it. Her whole body moved slightly with the music, not in an exaggerated way but naturally, as if the melody was flowing through her. There was a technical passage coming up, one that Professor Huang had worried about. It required quick fingerwork and precise timing. In practice, Mina occasionally stumbled here. His hands clenched at his sides as the moment approached. Mina reached the passage. Her fingers moved rapidly across the keys. There was a tiny hesitation, barely noticeable, a split second where she seemed to recalibrate. But then she continued, navigating through the difficult section with determination. It wasn't flawless. A couple of notes weren't quite as clean as they could have been, but she didn't stop. She didn't panic. She kept going, maintaining the spirit of the piece even when the technical execution wavered. One of the judges, a renowned pianist from Austria, leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "She's not just playing the notes. She understands the music." His colleague nodded slowly, equally surprised. The piece moved into its famous recurring theme again, and here Mina's playing became more confident. This was the section she knew best, the melody that people hummed even if they didn't know its name. She played it with such genuine sweetness that several people in the audience found themselves smiling without realizing it. A woman in the 5th row, a piano teacher herself with 2 students competing that day, felt unexpected tears forming. She'd heard this piece performed hundreds of times by students of all ages and skill levels, but there was something about hearing it played by someone so young, Someone who couldn't possibly understand heartbreak or loss or the complex emotions Beethoven had woven into the composition, yet somehow channeled those feelings anyway. Mina was completely absorbed in the performance now. The audience had disappeared from her awareness. The judges, the cameras, the enormous hall with its golden decorations, none of it existed for her in that moment. There was only the piano and the music flowing from her fingers, her small hands stretched to reach certain intervals, and occasionally she couldn't quite make the reach that an adult pianist could. But she adapted, finding ways to express the musical ideas even when the physical limitations challenged her. Professor Huang had taught her these adaptations, but watching her execute them under pressure, in front of hundreds of people, made his eyes water. The piece moved toward its conclusion. The final section returned to the gentle, contemplative mood of the opening. Mina played it even more softly now, her touch on the keys so light that people in the back rows had to strain to hear. It was a risk playing that quietly in such a large hall, but it created an intimate feeling as if she was playing just for herself. The final notes came, the melody winding down like a music box slowly stopping. Mina's hands lifted from the keys, and for a moment there was absolute silence in the hall. That strange, suspended moment where a performance has ended but the spell hasn't quite broken. Then the applause began. It started in scattered places and quickly built into something powerful. People weren't just clapping politely. They were standing, rising from their seats with genuine enthusiasm. The applause grew louder, more insistent. Some people were calling out encouragement. Mina, startled by the response, remembered what Professor Huang had taught her about bowing. She stood up from the piano bench, took a small step forward, and bowed carefully the way she'd practiced. The applause somehow got even louder. In the wings, her mother finally opened her eyes. Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling. Her father pulled her close, his own eyes red. Professor Huang was wiping his glasses, his hands shaking slightly. None of them could quite believe what had just happened. Mina walked off the stage, looking tiny again now that the music had stopped. The moment she was behind the curtain, her mother scooped her up, holding her tight. "You were amazing," she whispered. "So amazing. Did I do it right?" Mina asked, her voice small and uncertain despite the thunderous applause still echoing from the hall. "You were perfect," Professor Huang said, his voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." They were ushered to a waiting area where other performers who had already competed were gathered with their families. The moment they entered, several people began approaching them. Other competitors, teenage musicians who'd been dismissive or skeptical before, now looked at Mina with new respect. Some asked to take photos with her. Parents congratulated her parents, sharing genuinely warm smiles. One competitor, a 13-year-old girl from Japan who had performed beautifully earlier, knelt down to Mina's level. "That was really special," she said in careful English. "I've been playing for 9 years and I still don't play with that much feeling. You have a gift." Mina, not fully understanding the significance of what she'd accomplished, simply smiled shyly and said, "Thank you." As more performers finished their pieces, the waiting area filled up. Some played with incredible technical precision, their fingers moving so fast they seemed to blur. Others played pieces far more complex than for Elise, compositions that required years of advanced training. The level of talent was astounding, and with each new performance, Mina's parents felt their hope dimming slightly. Yes, their daughter had done well. Yes, the audience had loved her. But surely against this level of competition, her chances were small. The performances continued through the afternoon. The judges took notes, scored each performance, and conferred quietly among themselves. They had strict criteria: technical accuracy, musical interpretation, stage presence, and overall artistic merit. Age was not supposed to be a factor in the scoring. A good performance was a good performance regardless of the performer's age. But several judges found themselves thinking about the tiny child who had played Beethoven with such heart. Yes, there had been technical imperfections. Yes, her small hands had created physical limitations, but there had been something in her performance that transcended technique. There was artistry there, genuine musicality that couldn't be taught. By evening, all the performances were complete. The competitors and their families were invited to remain in the hall for the closing ceremony, where results would be announced. The wait was agonizing. Families sat together, some looking confident, others nervous. Mina had fallen asleep in her mother's lap, exhausted from the long day and the emotional intensity of performing. Her father gently stroked his daughter's hair while her mother held her close. Professor Huang sat beside them, looking drained but content. Whatever happened next, they'd given Mina an experience she'd never forget. They'd shown her that she could stand on a world stage and share her gift. That was worth everything they'd sacrificed to be here. The competition director took the stage and began speaking about the high level of performances they'd witnessed. He thanked all the participants, acknowledged the judge's difficult task, and praised the young musicians for their dedication. Then he began announcing the results, starting with honorable mentions, moving through third place, then second. Each name that wasn't Mina's brought a complicated mixture of disappointment and relief. They'd given their best, and that was enough. It had to be enough. Then the director paused, looking down at his notes with a slight smile. "Our first place winner," he began, "performed with a level of musical maturity and emotional depth that the judges found extraordinary, particularly given her age." Mina's mother felt her heart stop. Her father gripped her hand. "From South Korea," the director continued, "performing Beethoven's For Elise, our first-place winner is Mina Park." For a moment, none of them moved. They sat frozen, unable to process what they'd just heard. Then the hall erupted in applause, and people around them were turning, smiling, pointing. Professor Huang stood up, his legs shaky, reaching down to help Mina's mother stand, to wake Mina gently. "Sweetheart," her mother said, her voice breaking, "you won. You won first place." Mina, confused and sleepy, rubbed her eyes. She didn't fully understand what winning meant, didn't grasp that she'd just accomplished something extraordinary. She only knew that everyone was clapping again, and her parents were crying happy tears, and Professor Huang was smiling at her in a way she'd never seen before. Her father lifted her into his arms and carried her toward the stage to accept the award. As they walked down the aisle, the applause continued, people standing once again, this time not just for a performance but for something bigger. For possibility, for proof that sometimes talent and heart matter more than age or experience. Everything had changed in a matter of hours, though none of them fully understood it yet. Their lives waiting for them back in Seoul would never be the same. The flight back to Seoul felt different from the one that had taken them to Vienna. On the way there, they'd been filled with nervous anticipation and doubt. Now they carried with them a trophy, a medal, and a video that had already started spreading across the internet faster than they could comprehend. Someone in the audience had recorded Mina's performance on their phone and posted it online. Within hours, it had thousands of views. By the time they landed in Seoul, it had millions. Comments poured in from around the world in dozens of languages. People were amazed, inspired, skeptical, moved. The video was being shared on social media platforms, featured on news websites, and discussed in music forums everywhere. The family had no idea about any of this until they turned on their phones after landing. Mina's mother's phone immediately started buzzing with notifications. Messages from relatives, friends, acquaintances she hadn't spoken to in years. Her email inbox was flooded. Professor Huang's phone was the same, overwhelmed with messages from colleagues, former students, and reporters requesting interviews. At the airport, they were met not just by waiting family members but by local news crews. Cameras and microphones were thrust toward them as they pushed their luggage cart through the terminal. Questions came from all directions. How did it feel to win? When did Mina start playing? What were her plans for the future? Mina's father instinctively moved to shield his daughter from the chaos. She clung to her mother, frightened by the sudden attention. This wasn't like the applause in Vienna. This was overwhelming, invasive, confusing. Professor Huang quickly stepped forward, politely but firmly telling the reporters that the family needed space and time to rest. The drive home should have been a moment to decompress and process everything that had happened. Instead, Mina's parents sat in the back seat, scrolling through their phones in disbelief, watching their daughter's performance being shared and commented on by strangers around the world. Mina herself had fallen asleep between them, exhausted and unaware that her life had fundamentally changed. The next morning, their small apartment was surrounded by reporters and camera crews. Neighbors peeked out of windows and doors, curious about the commotion. The building manager had to ask the media to stay on the public sidewalk and stop blocking the entrance. Mina's parents kept the curtains drawn, trying to create some sense of normalcy for their daughter. But the phone calls didn't stop. Music schools from around the world reached out with scholarship offers. Concert halls invited Mina to perform. Talent agents wanted to represent her, Record labels expressed interest. Corporate sponsors offered endorsement deals. The numbers being discussed were staggering, more money than the family could have imagined. Professor Huang came to their apartment that afternoon. He looked as tired as they felt. Together, the adults sat at the small kitchen table while Mina played with toys in the next room, blissfully unaware of the decisions being made about her future. "We need to be very careful here," Professor Huang said quietly. "I've seen talented children burn out before. The pressure, the expectations, the loss of a normal childhood, it destroys them, and eventually it destroys their love of music." Mina's mother nodded, her eyes red from lack of sleep and stress. "I just wanted her to have a chance to share her gift. I never imagined it would become this." "None of us did," her father added. He looked at the pile of papers on the table, contracts and offers that required responses. Some of these opportunities could secure her future. They could pay for her education, for a better apartment, help our whole family. How do we say no to that? Professor Huang leaned back in his chair. By remembering what matters most. Mina is 4 years old. She should be learning to tie her shoes and making friends and discovering the world. Yes, she has an extraordinary gift, but that gift will still be there in 5 years, in 10 years. What won't be there if we're not careful is her childhood. They talked for hours, weighing options, discussing possibilities. They decided to decline most of the immediate opportunities. No endorsement deals, no recording contracts yet, no extensive performance tours. They would accept a few select performances, ones that felt meaningful and wouldn't overwhelm her. They would continue lessons with Professor Huang, but keep her practice schedule reasonable. And most importantly, Mina would stay in preschool, continue playing with neighborhood children and live as normal a life as possible. It wasn't an easy decision. The money they were turning down could have changed everything for their family, but they agreed that Mina's well-being was worth more than financial security. They'd find other ways to make ends meet. The media attention gradually lessened over the following weeks, though it never completely disappeared. Occasionally, someone would recognize Mina at the grocery store or in the park. Some people were kind and respectful. Others pulled out their phones to take pictures without asking. A few even criticized her parents in online comments, calling them stage parents or accusing them of exploiting their child. Those comments hurt, especially because they were trying so hard to do the opposite. But Professor Huang reminded them that people who don't know them would always have opinions. What mattered was that they knew their intentions and were doing their best. 3 months after Vienna, Mina performed at a charity concert in Seoul. It was held at a beautiful but modestly sized venue, far from the grandeur of the Musikverein. The concert was raising money for music education programs in underfunded schools. Mina played for Elise again, but this time she also played simpler pieces. Children's songs that the young audience could sing along to. Watching from the audience, her parents saw something that confirmed they'd made the right choices. Mina was smiling. She wasn't nervous or overwhelmed. She was having fun, sharing music with people, connecting with other children in the audience. This wasn't about winning or impressing judges. It was about the pure joy of playing. After the performance, instead of rushing off to another obligation, they went out for ice cream as a family. Mina got chocolate, her favorite, and talked excitedly about a butterfly she'd seen in the park that morning. She mentioned the piano performance only briefly, more interested in telling her parents about a new friend she'd made at preschool. As they walked home that evening, Mina skipping ahead while her parents followed hand in hand, her mother said quietly, "Do you think we made the right choice? Turning down all those opportunities?" Her father watched their daughter, carefree and happy, chasing fallen leaves on the sidewalk. "I think we made the only choice that lets her stay who she is." Professor Huang continued teaching Mina, but their lessons remained a sacred space, protected from the outside pressure. He introduced her to new pieces, helped her technique grow stronger, and most importantly, kept her love of music alive. He never mentioned competitions or performances unless Mina brought them up herself. 1 year after Vienna, on Mina's 5th birthday, the family gathered in their apartment for a small celebration. A few cousins came over, along with some friends from preschool. There was a cake with 5 candles, presents wrapped in colorful paper, and the cheerful chaos that comes with young children playing together. Later, after the guests had left and the apartment was quiet again, Mina went to their old upright piano. Without anyone asking, without any expectation or pressure, she began to play. Not for Elise this time, but a simple melody she'd been working on with Professor Huang. Her parents listened from the kitchen, washing dishes and putting away leftover cake. "She still loves it," her mother said softly, almost surprised. "She does," her father agreed, "and that's what matters." The trophy from Vienna sat on a shelf in their living room, a reminder of an extraordinary moment. But it wasn't the centerpiece of their home or their lives. It was just one part of Mina's story, not the whole story itself. As Mina grew older, more opportunities would come. There would be more performances, more competitions if she wanted them, more chances to share her gift with the world. But her parents and Professor Huang had made a commitment that day in their small kitchen, surrounded by overwhelming offers and possibilities. They committed to protecting her childhood, her joy, and her choice to love music on her own terms. Sometimes reporters still asked about her future. Would she become a famous concert pianist? Would she attend a prestigious music conservatory? Would she pursue music professionally? Her parents had learned to smile and give the same answer. "We'll let her decide when she's ready. For now, she's just a little girl who loves to play piano." And on most days, that's exactly what Mina was. She went to school, played with friends, learned to ride a bike, scraped her knees, laughed at silly jokes, and occasionally sat at an old upright piano to make music that came from somewhere deep in her heart. The world had seen her as a prodigy, a sensation, a news story. But her family saw her as something much simpler and more precious. A child who deserved to be exactly that. A child. Years later, people would ask Mina about that moment in Vienna, about winning first place at 4 years old, about how it changed her life. She would smile and say it gave her opportunities, yes, but the real gift wasn't the trophy or the recognition. The real gift was having parents and a teacher who loved her enough to protect her from the weight of her own talent, who understood that being extraordinary didn't mean giving up the simple joys of an ordinary childhood. The piano still sat in their living room, its keys worn smooth from years of practice and play, and sometimes on quiet evenings music would fill their small apartment, played by fingers that had once been so tiny they could barely reach the keys, now growing stronger and more skilled with each passing year, but still playing with that same pure love that had captivated an audience halfway around the world.